Então, nós vamos fazer a apresentação agora do Niel. O Niel ele é um consultor especializado em modelos de pagamento baseados em valor. Ele vai falar sobre exemplos no mundo onde isso avançou mais. E eu posso dizer uma coisa para vocês, com certeza, que aonde existem avanços no modelo de pagamento baseado em valor, talvez não seja tanto pela disposição das partes em dialogarem, mas sim pela disposição, assim pela profissionalização da mobilização dos pacientes, que em outros locais eles são mais avançados do que aqui no Brasil. Eu posso exemplificar nesse sentido. Existe um exemplo muito interessante nesse sentido. Nos Estados Unidos, o teste do pezinho, ele acontece nos estados, são os estados que definem quais são as doenças que vão ser testadas, e a gente percebe que tem estado que testa 5 doenças e tem estado que testa 32 doenças. Isso claramente é resultado da capacidade de organização e mobilização dos pacientes. Ou seja, a ideia é: não vamos esperar que os pacientes nos encostem na parede para que a gente possa chegar em soluções em termos de doença e acesso. Então, vamos passar então a aula do Dr. Niel, por favor. Obrigado.
Today I'm going to speak to you on the international experience with outcomes-based agreements. The focus of most of my presentation will be on the European markets, but I will also briefly touch on some interesting recent developments in the US market. So what am I going to cover today? Well, I'll start with a few reflections on the objectives of managed entry, generally, including outcomes-based approaches. I'll then look at 3 European markets in particular: the UK, which has been looking to negotiate what it calls smart deals with pharmaceutical companies; with Italy, a global pioneer in managed entry; and Spain, a relative newcomer to this area, but a country that is developing some interesting technology to support outcomes-based agreements. I'll then reflect on the experience in a few other countries which are showing growing interest in outcomes-based approaches. And then I'll focus on the experience of one drug in particular, which is perhaps the best documented in terms of the experience with outcomes-based agreements, and that's Zolgensma. I'll then go on to look at an innovative managed entry model for gene therapies that has recently been proposed in Germany, and then look at what's been happening recently in the United States in terms of the use of warranties for cell and gene therapies. And then I'll conclude with a few reflections on the lessons that can be drawn from international experience. So what are the objectives of managed entry? And it's important to note that the taxonomy of managed entry agreements can be quite complex, but in the interests of simplicity, I've tried to distill it down to 3 broad categories, which I show on the slide here, and they address 3 fundamental objectives. The first is to control budget impact, and the typical managed entry approach to address this objective is financially based agreements, and there's a wide variety of those approaches, everything from simple discounts through price volume agreements to caps on the use of products at the patient or population level. And indeed, it's important to understand that these financially based agreements can operate at both the population and patient level. The second fundamental objective that's addressed by managed entry is tackling uncertainty around new drugs, a lack of robust evidence at launch. And the standard approach to this problem is to employ coverage with evidence development. So collection of data on a large scale post-marketing, and this operates at the population level. And then we have the third objective, and that is to manage variable response rates for some drugs. And this is where outcomes-based agreements really come into their own, and they would typically operate at the patient-specific level. Managed entry has become increasingly common in recent years, and it's important to note that financially based approaches remain by far the most widely used, and that's in essence because of their simplicity and their relative predictability. By comparison, outcomes-based approaches are considered to be somewhat onerous to administer, and for that reason they are generally reserved for a limited number of products. So let's consider the experience of the UK, which, as I've already indicated, has been something of a pioneer in this field in recent years. And NHS England, the body that oversees the National Health Service in England, developed a commercial framework for new medicines, which I've tried to summarize in this slide. And I appreciate there's a lot of detail to absorb, and in the interest of time, I won't go through it in minute detail. But it's important to understand that simple discounts remain the preferred option for NHS England for the reasons that I've already mentioned, above all, their simplicity and predictability. Other financially based approaches such as budget caps, price volume agreements, and cost sharing are on the increase, although still far less common than simple discounts. A practice that certainly has gained momentum in recent years is coverage with evidence development, and that's been most notable in what is known as the Cancer Drugs Fund, making innovative oncology drugs available in a timely fashion, but collecting post-marketing data to support their subsequent reevaluation to determine whether or not they should be routinely adopted by the National Health Service. And outcomes-based agreements, as I've already indicated, are relatively rare in the scheme of managed entry approaches used in England. This shot from NHS England is a snapshot of what are called innovative treatment agreements or smart deals for a period of 1 year, from November 2021 to November 2022. And we don't have time to go through all of them in detail. And not all of them, by any means, are what we would consider outcomes-based approaches. But there is a wide range of deals, mainly for new drugs. But it's also worth noting that there have been some deals for established products, and that includes some multi-company agreements. NHS England conducts 30 to 40 commercial surgeries, so meetings with pharmaceutical companies to discuss their ideas for innovative approaches to access, including potentially outcomes-based agreements. And this is really an opportunity for companies to present their ideas on novel approaches to negotiating access with the National Health Service in the UK for drugs they may have in development. The chart on the right gives you a sense of the composition of managed entry agreements in England, and it really reinforces the point that I've already made, that financially based approaches dominate the managed entry landscape in England. But as I've just indicated, NHS England is always receptive to ideas for innovative approaches, and it's particularly interested in striking partnerships with companies to identify patients who may be eligible for innovative therapies, and also to enlist their help in redesigning services. And that's especially important where you're dealing with highly disruptive new health technologies, which would require significant change in clinical pathways. That's where it's particularly important for companies to engage with the health service to help them to implement those changes on the ground. And here on the left, you have a few comments from Blake Dark, who was the Commercial Medicines Director of NHS England from 2018 to 2022. He said, having companies work with us to invest in finding patients and at the same time putting that as part of the procurement around the actual acquisition cost of the medicine is smart procurement, because we're solving the problem and we're coming together rather than just buying a drug. And specifically in reference to cell and gene therapies, he said that companies can get those through, get them reimbursed and used in practice in the healthcare system by pricing responsibly and working with NICE, the HTA body in England, doing so fairly and intelligently and helping the healthcare system to have its services ready for their drugs. That really is a key to accelerating access. And he made the point that shareholders will appreciate
Kelly,
the
tudo
time
bem?
they get
Você me escuta,
upfront
Kelly?
within patent as being incredibly valuable. So in essence, what NHS
minutinho,
England
Kelly.
is offering companies is faster and in some cases broader access to their products, but in return for very competitive pricing. Moving on to Italy. This is another country that really has been a pioneer of managed entry, going back well over 15 years to 2005. And that was when we saw the launch of a national system of online
Kelly, tudo bem?
registries, which has evolved over the years since then. This infrastructure is funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Companies pay 30,000 euros for 3 years of a registry on the IFA platform, IFA, of course, being the Italian Medicines Agency. But although they fund the registries, it's important to be aware that they are controlled by IFA, the Italian Medicines Agency. Going back a decade or so, we saw a proliferation of payment by results deals in Italy, particularly in the period 2013 to 2017. But since then, we've seen a significant shift away from payment by results to appropriate prescribing deals. And that reflects a change in terms of funding of drugs in Italy, specifically the creation of what's known as innovative medicines funds for oncology and non-oncology drugs, and they have recently been consolidated into a single fund with a budget in excess of €1 billion per year. Drugs that are deemed to be fully innovative by the Italian Medicines Agency are eligible for inclusion in that innovative medicines fund, and importantly are also added to regional formularies. And it's important to be aware that Italy is a country with a highly regionalized healthcare system. On the right, you can see the breakdown of managed entry agreements as of the end of 2022. And you can see that there were 6 cost-sharing agreements, 7 capping agreements, 10 payment by results schemes, and 3 payment at results schemes. And it's important to understand the distinction between payment by results and payment at results. Payment at results is characterized by one particular feature, and that is the use of installment payments. But as you can see from this chart, payment at results schemes are still very uncommon. Just 3 deals to date, 1 for a gene therapy and 2 for CAR T cell therapies, with payments staggered over a year for the cell therapies and over several years for the gene therapy. Spain was a relative latecomer to managed entry, certainly at the national level. Previously, there were some deals at regional or local level. Catalonia in particular was the region that was most active in terms of the use of managed entry. And in addition, we saw some activity at the local level in Spain, with deals negotiated by individual hospitals with companies. But in 2019, there was a significant development with the creation by the Spanish government of what is known as Valtamed. This is an online platform to collect data, and which is an important tool in supporting the use of outcomes-based agreements in Spain. It's designed to provide optimal information for appropriate decision-making throughout the drug life cycle. And that's an important point, that it will really track drugs across the life cycle, not just in the period around launch. A key objective of the Valtamed platform is going from efficacy to effectiveness, and that is facilitated by the ability to record data from the real life experience of patients. And it's worth noting that it has been designed, among other reasons, to facilitate payment by results deals. This continues to evolve as a platform, and in the future, patients will be able to enter information related to their quality of life, and that will facilitate cost-effectiveness analysis, which will be increasingly important in Spain in the years ahead. And Spain, like Italy, is a highly regionalized, decentralized healthcare system, so the Ministry of Health is working to integrate Valtamed into regional IT systems. On the right, I've just summarized one such deal, a payment by results agreement, that was noteworthy because it had a regional pricing variation. So the company received a partial payment on account that was adjusted based on the results of each patient and in each region. And then using data from Valtamed, the regions periodically evaluate the results and use the data to calculate the payments that are due. And then at the national level, the Ministry of Health reviews the response rates and procedures annually with a view to calculating the cost of therapy the company must bear and potentially negotiating adjustments to the terms of the deal. So what are we seeing in some other countries in Europe? Well, I'll just mention some developments in three in particular. France is a country that historically showed relatively limited interest in outcomes-based agreements, but there was a significant development at the end of last year with legislation that was passed with particular reference to advanced therapy medicinal products, so cell and gene therapy. So this would apply where it's not proved possible to negotiate a mutually acceptable price by conventional means. And in those circumstances, the authorities will be able to, in essence, impose an outcomes-based agreement and to set the terms for that deal. And that would also include installment payments. So this is potentially a significant change in France. It's really yet to be fully implemented, but it will be interesting to see what impact that has for cell and gene therapies in the French market going forwards. In Germany, which I've not included on this slide, we have seen a few deals in the past that have been negotiated with individual health insurance funds for high-cost drugs. And that has really been pending completion of the national HTA process. But as in France, enthusiasm for outcomes-based agreements has generally been somewhat limited in Germany. Similarly, the Netherlands has not been particularly active in negotiating outcomes-based agreements historically, but we have seen a noteworthy development in recent months, and that was the announcement of what's called the Orphan Drug Access Protocol, or ODAP. And that is interesting because it's in essence a hybrid managed entry experiment. It's a 3-year pilot project which could be extended, and will seek to combine an outcomes-based agreement with coverage with evidence development for between 3 and 5 orphan drugs. And what's interesting is that it will have 3 distinct pricing phases. So in phase 1, the company will be expected to supply the drug free of charge. In phase 2, if the drug meets outcomes targets for individual patients, then the insurer will reimburse the costs for that patient, but at a reduced price on the basis that data are still being collected to demonstrate the drug's value. And then in phase 3, if evidence collection demonstrates general effectiveness, insurers may decide on reimbursement at group level. The evidence will be collected from registries. They could be pre-existing registries, or it may be necessary to establish new registries specifically to support this program. And then finally, in Sweden, TLV, the national HTA agency, has expressed a desire to make greater use of outcomes-based agreements in the future. It specifically said that these payment models can reduce the risk that the payment for a drug will be too high in relation to the benefits the treatment provides when it is used in everyday clinical life. By reducing the payer's risk, these payment models can therefore be part of the solution in making ATMPs available to patients. And something else that I think is certainly worth noting and following going forwards is that TLV has developed a simulation tool which is intended to model the effects of different types of OBAs. At present, that is available only in Swedish, which is a limiting factor for use by interested parties outside the country. But it will be interesting to see how that works out, and indeed whether that might be made available in English in the future. So let's just focus for a few minutes on the experience of one drug. And as I indicated at the outset of today's presentation, it's probably the drug with the most information in the public domain in terms of the use of outcomes-based agreements and other managed entry approaches. Although it's important to recognize that details of how these deals have worked in practice are extremely limited. Avexis, which is now part of Novartis, the owner of Zolgensma, really tried to lay the groundwork for the launch of the drug in Europe by holding meetings with over 100 stakeholder organizations across the continent, with a view to ensuring that the program would be compatible with the pricing and reimbursement frameworks of countries across Europe, and also to ensure that the mechanisms could be tailored to individual markets. So they developed a toolkit of customizable options, and that included deferred payments and installment options to help to offset initial budget impact, outcomes-based rebates that could be backdated for patients treated during the early access period, but also importantly, the program included training for healthcare professionals on the administration of the therapy and provision of follow-up care. And I think that's particularly important in the case of very innovative therapies such as this, not to underestimate the challenges that healthcare professionals will face in adopting these programs and providing the training and support to help them to make that transition. And a further element was the provision of access to a global registry of spinal muscular atrophy patients that could be linked to national registries. So this was a toolkit, as I say, that was made available. And as the name of this initiative implies, Zolgensma Day One, the objective was really to try to remove some of the obstacles that could easily get in the way of early reimbursement for a high-cost gene therapy. By putting these provisions in place from the outset and engaging with payers and other stakeholders in advance of the launch of the therapy. So how has that worked out in practice in in the major European markets and in the United States? Well, we have seen use of outcomes-based agreements with installment payments in at least several of those countries. In Germany, outcomes-based agreements were negotiated with individual health insurance funds, and that was pending the completion of the national HTA process and the negotiation of rebates. However, that national HTA process found no evidence of additional benefit for the therapy relative to comparator. And as a result, there is now a requirement for patients to be enrolled in a registry, which will gather evidence that will support a reassessment of the drug in 2027. Italy agreed to a payment at results deal, which extends over 4 years with milestone payments each year. And similarly, Spain also has a payment by results deal linked with a price volume agreement. And then in the United States, Avexis offered installment payments as well as outcomes-based agreements over 5-year period. But just recently, Reuters has reported that Novartis has indicated that no payers took up the offer of installment payments in the United States, and outcomes-based agreement refunds have been rare in that country. We also gained some interesting insights from an interview given a few months ago by Teysale Muller, the global head of value and access at Novartis, on Zolgensma day 1, and he really made the point that their objective was to work within existing frameworks to open up access in countries without pre-existing early access pathways. So some countries, of course, have well-established early access routes, France being perhaps the best example. And they achieved that, or look to achieve that, by offering ministries of health and reimbursement bodies flexible options of the kind that I've already described in the Zolgensma Day 1 toolkit. Teysale Muller also made the point that in terms of pricing strategy, it's really important to reflect the transformative nature of a potentially curative gene therapy, but at the same time to take account of income levels, local affordability barriers, and economic realities in individual markets, and to ensure that options are flexible and customizable and can be tailored to individual cohorts or groups of patients. And a further observation that he made was on the importance of partnering with advocacy groups, really to understand their unmet needs in relation to the therapies that may be available. And of course, for some gene therapies, there are already well-established treatment options. In others, perhaps they're entering markets where no effective therapies are currently available. But it's also important, in his experience, to engage with local health authorities at an early stage, really to get a good understanding of how they would define long-term value for such new products. So moving on, I'd like just to share with you a few thoughts on a model that's recently been proposed in Germany by CSL Bearing, which has recently launched a new gene therapy for hemophilia B. And as I indicated, Germany historically has not been a particularly receptive market for outcomes-based approaches. But this was the model that CSL Bearing proposed for Germany, and which I guess could potentially be applied with modifications in some other countries. So this would apply specifically to single administration therapies that are potentially curative, and significantly that are entering a market where existing chronic treatments may already be available. Now, it's important in CSL Bearing's view to understand the central problem of uncertainty regarding the duration of effect of single administration therapies. And that is in large measure a reflection of the limited duration of clinical studies. So the model that they have proposed entails annual adaptive payments that would be aligned with the annual treatment costs of the existing standard of care. And they would be paid only subject to yearly proof of success, and would also be subject to a predetermined time limit. So that means that the new treatment would cost no more than the current standard of care, and could ultimately cost significantly less in the long term if the effects last longer than the agreed period of payments, the predetermined time limit. And that would be because payers would be spared the costs of the long-term medication that they would otherwise have had to fund. So the appeal of this model is that it would guarantee payers no additional costs over the existing standard of care and potentially substantial savings. And when you're talking about an indication such as haemophilia, where costs can be in excess of a €250,000 per year, those are important considerations. As I said earlier, our focus today has been largely on the European experience, but I would just like to say a few words about an interesting development that we've seen in recent months in the US market, and that's the announcement from a number of companies of warranties, particularly for high-cost therapies such as cell and gene therapies, although not necessarily uniquely for these types of products. So the thinking is that warranties are in essence a simpler approach than outcomes-based agreements, for the reason that it's not necessary to negotiate deals with individual payers. One practitioner of this approach actually made an analogy with the warranty that you would have on a car. That's something that you would expect and that is provided automatically when you buy a car and would not be negotiated on an individual basis. And that's in essence this thinking behind this warranty approach to high-cost therapies. So Pfizer, Sanofi, and BioMarin are among the companies that have recently announced warranty deals in recent months. But we've also seen Marsh, which is the world's leading insurance broker, and Octavian Financial, a company that specializes in developing financial and insurance arrangements for advanced therapies, announcing collaboration to offer a warranty program for cell and gene therapies. And they've said that they feel that this approach is better suited to these types of drugs than our outcomes-based agreements. And their belief is that companies will now have a platform that can create a differentiated warranty program that, unlike current solutions, will be meaningful to payers and can drive greater usage of their products, and in the process also potentially save healthcare systems money and, above all, have the benefit of improving patients' lives. So, in conclusion, what are some of the lessons that we can draw from the international experience with outcomes-based agreements? Well, I think it's really crucial to bear in mind the administrative burden of these agreements. That can be onerous and a real obstacle in the minds of payers and healthcare systems to the adoption of these types of agreements. So realistically, these are not going to be used commonly, and financially based managed entry approaches will always be preferred for their simplicity and predictability, although the specific objectives will be different from those of outcomes-based agreements. Looking back on the experience of Italy, England, and Spain, I think we can see the importance of investing in a robust digital infrastructure system to collect the data that are needed to support outcomes-based agreements. In terms of installment payments, they can present problems, and that would be the case particularly where patients are likely to change insurers. So that is not so much of an issue in some healthcare systems, in particular national health service type systems, but in others where you have a number of health insurers, social medicine based systems, for example, that could be a problem, and there could even be legal obstacles to signing agreements that may apply over multiple years and that could in principle impose obligations on a different payer in the future. So it may be necessary to navigate these kinds of agreements when offering outcomes-based agreements that are linked with installment payments. The Italian and English experience with funds for innovative medicines shows that outcomes-based agreements and managed entry more generally can play an important role in supporting those programs and providing early access to highly innovative new drugs. Inevitably, the focus of managed entry and outcomes-based agreements in particular tends to be on new medicines, but it's worth bearing in mind that these deals may in some circumstances also be appropriate and beneficial for mature products. And of course, a key element of managed entry is speed of access, making innovative medicines available to patients who need them as quickly as possible, but at the same time, limiting the risk to the healthcare system. And speed of access is also important for companies, in particular for smaller companies. And experience, I think, has shown that sometimes long delays in negotiating outcomes-based agreements can present real problems for smaller companies and can even create situations that may prove unsustainable for them, forcing them to withdraw from the market. So trying to streamline that process as much as possible and simplify it is undoubtedly crucial. And outcomes-based agreements can provide opportunities for both healthcare systems and pharmaceutical companies to develop meaningful partnerships, and that they can address the challenges of adopting new health technologies by redesigning services and providing the support that healthcare professionals need if they are to embrace those new technologies. So really, I guess the concluding thought is that improving patients' quality of life by giving them timely access to appropriate medicines is the common goal of healthcare systems and drug manufacturers, and outcomes-based agreements can play a role in achieving that common objective.
O Dr. Niel ele já está conectado para a gente poder bater um papo com ele. Eu pediria que colocassem ele na... Hi Niel, good morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you very much again to be together with us. We have in this plenary around 200 people, and both are specialized in the team of outcome-based payments. And as I talked to you last week, Brazil has a public system and also a private system, and both are facing many problems of sustainability, and then the opportunity to understand better the outcome-based payments maybe could be a possible solution in a long term, and your presentation was very good. Congratulations for that. So now we will open the questions with the plenary. Only to make the kickoff here, I would like to ask you, out of Europe, what would be the scenario to improve the access of the drugs based in outcome-based payments, and countries like in Southeast of Asia, Australia, and other countries, and if you see any advance on that, and what is the image that you have from Brazil on that?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, or perhaps a series of questions. I think, as I hope I demonstrated in my presentation, clearly one of the key requirements for implementing outcomes-based agreements is a robust and well-developed infrastructure for the collection of the data that are needed to support these types of agreements. So I think we've seen a number of countries that have adopted a fairly systematic approach to that. I guess led by Italy. That's probably the best established system that's been in operation for nearly 20 years now and has evolved over that time. More recently, we've seen an interesting development in Spain in the Valtamed platform that, again, I mentioned in my presentation, and I think the UK has also gone some way towards developing those systems. I think that's clearly going to be a requirement if other countries in Europe and beyond, in other regions of the world, are going to embrace this approach. But I think for that to happen, I guess, taking a step back, first of all, you have to have the political will to do that. So, to put those infrastructures in place, and to see a role for managed entry generally in all of its forms, including outcomes-based approaches. And as I hope I demonstrated at the outset of my presentation, I think in essence there are those three broad objectives to managed entry, and the different approaches will serve the different objectives. So, I think for the financially based approaches will remain the most common because of reasons of simplicity and predictability, but outcomes-based approaches, I think, are particularly useful where you do have drugs with a variable response. I think we'll also see a growing use of coverage with evidence development in countries as a way of addressing more general uncertainty around drugs at launch. So, in terms of the Brazilian experience, I guess, those same principles would apply. You have to have the political will to adopt this approach, and a perception that it offers value and can be a way to offer access for drugs that have a relatively high price. In many cases are used in relatively small populations, so we're talking about rare disease therapies, and which may be associated with either a high level of uncertainty or variable response rates. And once you have that will in place, then, as I say, you have to put the systems in place, and then, of course, also secure the support of healthcare professionals on the ground. And that's a further challenge, I think, because these can be challenging administratively to implement. But I guess it's to be hoped that advances in terms of health data technology will facilitate that process going forwards.
Thank you, Niel. Someone would like to make a question? Okay. Well, in this meantime, you mentioned about the uncertainties that other countries, or maybe also in Europe, United States, that could be an obstacle in order to develop these agreements. What, in your opinion, would be fundamental in order to start to break these uncertainties?
Well, I think, again, it's a question of, first of all, of the will, and then putting the systems in place. I mean, if we take the UK as an example, we've seen that with the Cancer Drugs Fund over the last 7 or 8 years. So that's essentially a coverage with evidence development program for drugs that are judged to have considerable promise, but don't have certainty at launch. So the National Institute for Care and Health Excellence, NICE, may not be prepared to endorse their routine use in the National Health Service, but sees a place subject to discounts and the collection of real-world data to resolve those issues around uncertainty. And what we have seen to date is that most of the drugs that entered that system and have now emerged from it after several years have been recommended for routine use. So in part that reflects the good judgment, I think, in terms of the drugs that are deemed to be suitable candidates for that approach to be added to the Cancer Drugs Fund. So not all would be. They have to meet certain basic requirements. But once they have, then generally they have been supported for routine use once that process has been completed.
Okay, thank you, Niel. And another question that I would like to make is about the data. You mentioned that probably the main reason of uncertainty would be in the time of the launch, and not enough data in order to make agreements. So what would be the best solution for that? Is to start, the countries to start to invest in registries, and or maybe in the own clinical trials for the request of approval of the drug, to foresee some kind of real world data in order to improve this kind of uncertainty. What do you think about?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it reflects in part something of a divergence between the requirements of regulatory authorities and HTA and pricing and reimbursement agencies. So I think generally we're seeing regulatory bodies around the world looking to accelerate marketing authorization, so to approve drugs for use earlier, based on earlier studies and a less robust evidence base. Whereas not surprisingly, we see that payers, so that's HTA agencies and pricing and reimbursement authorities and insurers, are not necessarily so convinced and want a different standard of evidence. So there's something of a misalignment between those requirements. I think they are taking steps to close that gap and to achieve greater alignment, and real world evidence can play a part in that. We're certainly seeing that in Europe with a number of initiatives that in the first instance are driven by the European Medicines Agency, so on the regulatory side, but they are also mindful of the need to involve HTA bodies, and of course what we will be seeing in the next couple of years and beyond in Europe is a greater collaboration on HTA. So we're going to see the start of joint HTA at EU level. So in terms of how you close the evidence gap, I think one of the challenges is that there's probably greater alignment around the world, certainly within, and if we take Europe as a case in point, we've got, in essence, one agency that is making those regulatory decisions on behalf of all of the member states of the EU, so 27 countries. The HTA agencies are much more diverse in their approaches and what they consider to be acceptable evidence. So, you have some countries that are very open to the use of real-world evidence, others that are much more skeptical. I think Germany is probably the classical example. And there we are seeing, again, as I indicated in the case of Zolgensma, we're seeing a move towards the use of registries, so controlled by the German HTA body. But interestingly, just recently, the head of that body, the GBA, the Federal Joint Committee, actually acknowledged that the use of that approach, the registry approach, presents challenges of its own. So it's not a panacea to these problems, and it can be difficult to secure the support of companies they're finding. So it's not straightforward. I think if you are going to adopt registries, then there's probably a case for trying to take an international approach where possible, to consolidate the data and to minimize the workload. So I think that's going to be an interesting trend to follow going forwards. And I think something else that we're seeing, and I didn't really touch on in my presentation today, is growing cross-border collaboration on various aspects of access, including HTA. So we're seeing that with the AusCan NZ UK collaboration arrangement involving Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK. NICE International, I know, is working with HTA agencies and healthcare systems more generally around the world, including Brazil. I know there have been quite a few discussions between NICE and its counterparts in Brazil. So I think that will be interesting if that trend gathers momentum going forwards, to see what basis that may provide for establishing a more common evidence base and overcoming some of the challenges that the very disparate national, or in some cases even subnational, regional requirements impose.
Thank you, Niel. We have here one question from Giovanni Guzzo, Clinical Research Director of Biogen. As artificial intelligence is improving the research of new molecules and developing new biomarkers, do you believe this may difficult the understanding of the payers and governments to include new technologies? If so, how industries may support this understanding?
A really interesting question, and I'll be frank, it's an area that I've not been able to devote much time to as yet, but certainly one that I want to do a little more work in the coming months. I think there's probably been a lot of interest in the use of artificial intelligence in streamlining and accelerating the drug development process, which could potentially indirectly have implications for access if if this can be shown to be a success and reduce costs, drug development costs, and that potentially has some pricing implications down the line. And I think it's also worth saying that we're seeing in countries around the world a growing interest in finding out about public funding of drug development and the costs of drug development. And I think the thinking there is fairly clear, that in terms of factoring that into the pricing negotiation process. In terms of use of biomarkers, well, I guess with precision medicine generally, that there are obviously some additive costs in terms of testing, which is the fundamental requirement of that approach to medicine. So that's going to require investment. But I guess the benefit and the potential saving downstream is that you will have greater certainty in terms of the use of drugs, so a better prospect that when the drugs are prescribed, that they will prove successful because you've tested for biomarkers to ensure that patients are suitable candidates. Beyond that, I think it's going to be interesting to see what role AI could play and machine learning in terms of the processing of data. So if the use of some of these managed entry approaches, including outcomes-based agreements, does grow substantially in the coming years, I think aside from the burden of data collection, you then have the challenges of data analysis and interpretation. So potentially, I guess AI could play a useful role in that process. But again, as I say, that's an area that personally I wanted to do some further research in.
Thank you very much, Niel, for your presence and your brilliant presentation. And maybe another time you can be present in Brazil for another discussions on that. Thank you very much again, and see you in the next opportunity. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bom, nesse momento nós vamos para um coffee break que está sendo gentilmente patrocinado pela Fundação Getúlio Vargas, que nós vamos ter aqui na sala do lado. Muito obrigado.